Chapter 7. Bandaged and subdued, the pirates planted themselves on the floor and cot of their cell and silently wolfed down their food. But even when they were thus harmlessly engaged, they made an interesting spectacle, one which Carrie observed carefully, standing on the other side of the bars with her hands clasped behind her back. Kedge, the long, lanky one, had thin, mouse-colored hair, eyes that bugged out of his head whenever he was agitated, and a missing tooth on the right side of his mouth. It was hard to tell how old he was. He could have been anywhere from 30 to 50. His two comrades seemed to look on him as an inferior. He obviously contributed nothing to their endeavors with regards to intellect. But his height, long arms, and ability to fit into narrow spaces, and extreme flexibility, as well as his thorough, if unrefined, knowledge of how to use those attributes to his great advantage, had earned him a place in the raid, however much Borg regretted it now. Argo was the shortest member of the group, and had a square, solid frame. His head was completely shaved, and a long scar ran along it, from his forehead almost to the nape of his neck. He carried himself in an awkward, blocky way, like a bulldog. But he had a surprisingly soft, stealthy step, and was faster than he looked. He had a rough, low voice, and spoke in short, terse sentences. He didn't have much to say. Borg was the most fascinating one out of the group. As previously mentioned, he was of an abnormally massive build. His shoulder span was vast, and his torso and arms rippled with colossal power. His hair, dark brown with a few strands of iron gray, was oiled and slicked back over his head, cut an inch or so below his ears. A gold earring hung from his left ear. He had a long mustache that extended almost past his close-cut beard and was ornamented with metal beads. He was very hairy and darkly bronzed by his years at sea. He wore his shirt mostly unbuttoned, as if it were only a formality to have it in the first place. Strangely, when he was not in the midst of a mission, his manner was uncharacteristically polished, and he even possessed a suave smile that revealed his strong, white, almost predatorial teeth. But it seemed to be a sort of mask for the menacing, ruthless power that waited restlessly underneath, ready to be unleashed for any profitable cause. One could easily tell that he was the leader of the group and a commanding presence. Kedge was terrified of him, and Argo watched him carefully and stayed on good terms with him as often as possible. Of course, Carrie couldn't see all these details in a glance, but her evaluation was still thorough, curious, and profitable. She was just finishing her investigation of Borg himself when the pirate looked up. "May I offer you a cup of tea?" he asked with scathing politeness. Carrie's eyes twinkled. "Not at present, thanks." "What exactly are you doing, anyway?" "Just watching you eat." "What for?" Kedge asked sulkily. "I have to make sure you don't try to cut your way out of your cell with that butter knife," she said mockingly. Borg scowled and turned back to his food. "You can learn a lot about a man by watching him eat," Carrie continued. "Then you'd better look away," Borg said. "I don't think you could handle what you would learn." "You'd be surprised." A hint of a hard edge crept into Carrie's voice, making Borg look up with a frown to study her face. He gave a dismissive guffaw. "Sure." "Sure," Carrie echoed, darkly, but her brow cleared. "Now, let me ask you a question." "I'm all ears," Borg said. "Where are you from?" "That's a good question." "Nowhere." "That's not an answer." "Correct. This isn't my first interrogation, my dear. And never during any of them have I revealed the first detail about my missions." "I could have guessed as much," Carrie said. "And this isn't an interrogation. I just hoped you'd see reason, since your mission is most definitely over now." Borg suddenly smiled, a dangerous, deceptive smile. Carrie couldn't help but feel a slight chill run through her. "Is it?" he asked softly. "Is it over?" She set her face and looked him in the eyes. They stared at each other for a moment. Then Borg's eyes glazed over and he turned away, as if bored with the conversation. Savagely, he stabbed his fork into his meat and ate. He didn't look back up. When they finished eating, they obediently handed everything back through the bars, and Carrie left them. Kedge and Argo dozed off. Borg, who sat on the cot, which creaked and bent under his weight, leaned his back against the wall and stared darkly up at the ceiling. The fierce fire that always lurked in his eyes was burning low. He sat still for a while, and then, with a furtive glance down the corridor, reached under the collar of his shirt. He produced the vial which he had used earlier against his assailants. It had completely escaped the pre-imprisonment searches. He held it up to the light for a while, gazing at it. Had he made it to the sleeping quarters, he could have fumigated everyone there, causing a long, feverish sleep, and allowing him and his associates plenty of time to do what they had come to do, with minimal resistance. Borg was not used to failing, and he was not keen on spending weeks, perhaps months, in a ship's holding cell. He looked thoughtfully at the vial again. One drop would put him to sleep for several days in which his mind could be free. But no, one drop was very powerful, and he knew the side effects were less than desirable. Besides, if he slept that long, it would be hard to keep the potion a secret. Growling below his breath, he slipped the vial back into its holster, folded his arms, and closed his eyes. Here we change scenes. Jane and Jason enjoyed the time that they had spent touring the hamlet. The people, while somewhat reserved, were very polite. They were much quieter than hookies and carried themselves with great dignity and grace. They were a dark-haired, fair-skinned race, and most of them, men and women alike, were quite tall. Their clothing was simple but tasteful and comely. The women wore lightweight gowns of cream or pastel colors, their waists bound by wide leather belts and their feet laced up in leather boots. The men wore cream-colored tunics, brown or gray breeches, and long vests, with leather belts that almost always included a sheathed knife or sword. Led by Margaret and accompanied stonily by Ezra, the two American guests were returning to the royal house when they spotted a young man in a sort of wheelchair, propelling himself along the lane ahead of them at a surprisingly brisk pace. Margaret turned to her guests. "That is Mason Corley, of whom I am sure you have heard already." "Yes, we have," Jason said. "Do you think you could introduce us to him?" "Of course. Come on, let's catch up with him." They quickened their pace and finally reached the young man. Margaret called his name as they drew near. The wheelchair stopped, and he looked behind him. "Oh, hello, your majesties," he said in surprise, turning his wheelchair around in the lane and facing them with a respectful bow of the head. "Hello, Mason," Ezra said, shaking his hand and using a friendlier tone than the guests had yet heard from him. "How is the leg?" Margaret asked. "Some better today, thank you. I had a bad day yesterday, but perhaps it was the last." He turned to Jane and Jason. "Are these the guests we've been expecting?" "They are indeed," Margaret said. "Meet Jane Kent's and Jason Fields. The reports we heard about them were true. They passed the tower test, and Jason carries the sword of the kingdom." Mason looked up at them in astonishment for a moment. Jane thought he might not believe them. But then she noticed his eyes were watery. He blinked them hard, took off his cap, and bowed his head to Jane and Jason. He drew a slightly shaky breath. "It's an honor," he said simply. "It's our honor to meet an Inger hero," Jason returned. Once again, he felt uncomfortable, this time because someone respected him much more than he felt he merited. This feeling was getting old, fast. Mason looked at his feet. "I only did what I knew had to be done." "That's heroism," Jane said. "And I'm terribly sorry about your injury," she added. Mason laid a hand on his left leg, which was swathed in old cloths and crisscrossed with some sort of cord that held it all in place. His face tightened slightly, as if the mention of it had brought back memories of the wound, or reminded him of present pain. "It'll be all right," he said hesitantly. "It's just taking a while." "Mason," Margaret said, "don't forget that you are dining with us tonight." Mason brightened. "I won't. As a matter of fact, I was headed that way now." "Splendid. Then we'll all go together." They all moved onward down the lane. Ezra and Jason walked on either side of Mason's wheelchair. Ezra was talking to him about a fencing match that had taken place as part of a recent banquet's entertainment. Jason once gave Mason's wheelchair a little help getting around a difficult corner and over a rough spot in the lane, but Mason had retained an immense amount of upper body strength and did not need much assistance. Margaret and Jane strolled a little ways behind them. "Does he have a family to look after him?" Jane asked in a low voice. The princess shook her head sorrowfully. "No. His father died in a skirmish with the Terrafungs when Mason was only 7. His mother died of an illness a year after that. His neighbors took him in until he was old enough to live on his own. He earned a living by working with one of our blacksmiths. After he was wounded, however, different families, including mine, have cared for him. He went back to working at the blacksmith shop a couple weeks ago and manages to make his own meals and take care of himself, but we still try to make things easy for him by inviting him here as often as possible. It's the least we can do after what he has done for the tribe." In half an hour they had reached the house, freshened up, and entered the formal dining room, where they were joined by the Hookies, the royal family, and the ministers. There, a fine royal dinner was laid out on the long, polished table. Goblets filled with cider stood at each place, and the largest platter displayed a large roasted fowl with crispy brown skin. Various fruits and cheeses, a large tray of bread, and several dishes that weren't familiar to the two Americans were also on the table. Before everyone was seated, Taryn introduced Jane and Jason to his family. His wife, Queen Diana, a lovely woman with long brown hair, greeted them kindly and welcomed them to her home. Then they met Ellen, who was the next in line after Margaret. She was a shy, pretty girl of 15 with big eyes and soft, light brown hair. Taryn turned to introduce the next child and looked around. "Why, where is the lad?" he asked. Just then, the great oaken door at the far end of the dining room swung softly open, and a dark-haired boy of about 12, dressed in loose deerskin clothing, came silently in. He appeared to have hastily neatened his dark brown wavy hair and cleaned his face with a little water right before walking through the door. His eyes were a deep, smoky gray color with surprising depth of expression for a lad his age. Right at his heels, padding along with a soft, smooth stride, was a great, wolf-like dog. The boy moved quickly to his chair and stood still behind it, after nodding gravely to his father, mother, and Jane and Jason. The dog lay down quietly at his feet. The king grinned and shook his head. "Rossley, where have you been now?" "I was in the woods, father. I'm sorry for being late," the boy said. Taryn chuckled. "I should have known." He introduced Rossley formally to Jane and Jason. Next was Jack, an energetic boy of 10 with light brown hair, bleached from long hours playing in the sun. After him came Cullen, a quiet 8-year-old thinker who studied Jane and Jason gravely. Next came Ava and Anya, 6-year-old twins. Ava was prim and very ladylike, while Anya had a lively demeanor and a roguish sparkle in her eyes. Finally, Quinn, the baby, was barely 1 year old and sat in his little high chair with a supreme grin on his chubby face. The dinner party was completed by Aunt Alusa, Queen Diana's widowed eldest sister, who lived with the royal family. She was a gossipy, self-satisfied lady in her early 60s. She was thin and aristocratic, with a definite opinion, which she always freely expressed, about everything, and a tendency to talk a lot. She livened up their supper considerably. The food was delicious and the company pleasant, except for Ezra, that is, who maintained his icy silence throughout the meal. After an hour of dining and talking, they all withdrew to the family hall, which was basically a living room, with a roaring fire and a large stone fireplace, surrounded by comfortable furniture. There, Jane and Jason told their story again, so that the rest of the royal family could hear it. They hung on every word, even Taryn and the ministers. Once, when they had paused mid-narrative to catch their breath, Jane noticed that Mason, whose wheelchair was near her seat, was scribbling rapidly in a small book. "Mason, what are you working on?" she asked curiously. Mason looked up and turned his book where Jane could see it. She laughed in surprise to see her and Jason's names scattered through the writing. "What's this?" "I'm writing down your story. Ever since I was young, I've had a deep interest in history. Like Jerem," he added with a nod towards the hooky. He's done a whole lot better job of studying and compiling records than I have," Jerem said. "If that's true, which I doubt, it's only because our people keep books, while yours practice oral history, which makes it harder," Mason returned. "I've been mostly occupied with trying to write down the events that happened in my own lifetime. It is a difficult time for us all, but one that we should not forget in the future. At any rate, I know that what is happening now with the two of you in Griffyngrein is worth recording." Jason, who was sitting beside Jane, smiled. But as he turned his head, his eyes met Ezra's. The prince sat on the other side of the room, near the fireplace. The light flickered in his eyes, which had a curious, chilling expression in them as they looked intently at Jason. Was there scorn, even hatred, in that look? Jason looked back at the prince steadily. For a few moments, neither of them moved. But no one had noticed, and now one of the ministers said, "Do tell on, Jason. They must hear what happened at the tower." At the mention of the tower, Ezra suddenly broke his stare, looking away, almost as if ashamed. Jason turned quickly to the minister and went cheerfully on with his story, as if nothing had happened. But he did not forget that look in the prince's eyes. Chapter 8. Jane and Jason had a good night's rest, and arose the next day to eat a simple breakfast and then talk with the king and his ministers again. Everything was going very smoothly. All the ministers seemed to be inclined in Jane and Jason's favor, as did Taryn himself. The only thing that bothered Jason was Ezra's behavior. It didn't improve. Tensions between them were definitely rising. It was too subtle for others to notice so far, but he had a feeling that wouldn't last for long. Once, during a conversation with King Taryn, the sword of the kingdom was mentioned. "It's an honor to have it," Jason said, looking down at the glimmering weapon. "But I'll feel better when I learn how to use it." Ezra looked up. "What?" he said abruptly. Jason looked at him. "I said, I need to—" "I know what you said," Ezra replied coldly. "But I don't understand. You don't know how to use your sword?" "No." "You have never had sword fighting lessons?" "That's what I meant by no," Jason said frostily. He caught himself. "No, that's correct. I've never touched a sword before I got to Griffyngrein." Ezra shook his head in disbelief. "Then how could you possibly have the sword of the kingdom?" Jason fought the frustration rising in him. "I told you the story. You've heard it at least twice, right? It was waiting for me in the stone chest at the top of the tower after Jane and I passed the tower test. According to what Jerem and the others have told me, the items were magically intended for us. I don't know why, but that's how it is." He turned to Taryn. "Do you think I could get training here?" "Of course," Taryn said genially, breaking the tension that had developed in the room. "In fact, Ezra told me last night that our best swordsman, Master Remen, just recently finished training him. So, since he now has an opening in his list of students, I am sure he would be glad to train you. If we decide to make the alliance, we will host you and Jane here for as long as you need to develop your skills." Ezra stared at his father for a moment, and then sat back silently in his chair. He remained silent for the rest of the meeting. The day passed quietly. When they were not in session with the king, Margaret showed them the orchards and then the woods that climbed the foot of the mountain behind the hamlet. The woods were solemn, majestic, and deeply shady, but did not feel threatening or evil like the forest outside the hamlet walls. As they walked along in the gray, chilly early afternoon, they were chatting comfortably when Jason stopped. "Hold on a minute," he whispered. "I hear something." There was a slight movement in the leaves off to their right, and then the alarming twang of a bow, and the thud of an arrow striking some unseen target. Jason grabbed each of them and began to move quickly away, but Margaret stopped him. "Wait," she said, smiling. "We are safe." "But come and see." She led them toward the source of the noise. Pushing aside the bushes, she revealed the archer. It was Prince Rossley, and he made a curious picture as he launched arrows at his target nailed on a distant tree. Beside him lay his dog, watching him with the steady, quiet trust and loyalty always found in the eyes of the best dogs. The beast raised his head and looked fixedly at Jane, Jason, and Margaret when they came into view, but he knew them and remained silent. In a branch right over the boy's head, a large, fiercely beautiful falcon was perched, also eyeing the newcomers. Abruptly, it gave a piercing call, as if warning Rossley that someone was coming. But Rossley had already seen them and had lowered his bow. Lifting his arm, he gave a soft whistle and chirp. Immediately the falcon dropped to his arm and worked its way up to his shoulder. Jason noticed for the first time that there was some sort of padding under the boy's sleeve, protecting him from the sharp talons. "Hello, Rossley," Margaret said. "I'm sorry we interrupted your practice." "I don't mind. Not with you three, anyway," Rossley said. Jason went over to examine the target. He shook his head in amazement. "You're an incredible shot, Prince Rossley," he said as he walked back. Rossley bowed his head politely. "I practice often," he said. "Just for fun, or are you preparing for something bigger?" Jane asked. Rossley looked gravely into the distance, his eyes very thoughtful. "I do enjoy it for sport," he said, "but I also prepare. One day I might find myself in a position to protect the innocent from danger. When that time comes, I will be ready." Jason held out his right hand. "Your people are lucky," he said. Rossley grinned as he gave Jason a firm handshake. Margaret soon led them back down to the hamlet, leaving Rossley to his target practice. "Prince Rossley is something else," Jane said. "He's got an old soul." Margaret nodded. "He is a very intelligent and unusual child. Truthfully, we don't always fully understand him, but we are very fond of him." They passed about a week in the hamlet, going to meetings with the tribe's leaders, telling and retelling their story, and answering many questions, like they had with the Hookies. They were not present for the debates, and the Ingers were less forthcoming with their emotions than the Hookies had been. So Jane and Jason were much more in the dark as to the directions they were moving. They expected every day to either be expelled or welcomed as leaders. It was an unnerving sensation, but they tried not to think about it too much. Finally, 6 days after they had first arrived, Taryn summoned them with good news. His ministers had approved the alliance, and he had thus made his decision. On the very next day, he would announce the new alliance to his subjects at an evening ceremony. Jane and Jason thanked him heartily, and then discussed the details for the next day's ceremony. "Do you think the Inger tribe as a whole will embrace the decision?" Jason asked. Taryn nodded. "Yes, we are a tribe of warriors. For years we have been ready and willing to battle the Terfungs, only waiting for the right opportunity to come along. But it never did, and most of our encounters with the enemy were ill-fated. Furthermore, your alliance with the Hookies was a very important part as we considered joining you. They are one of the largest tribes, with the most capable warriors in the kingdom, besides our own. Since they are behind you, and since you passed the tower test and had a positive interaction with one of the Griffins, it will be clear to our people that the right opportunity has finally come." They passed the evening with the royal family, much as they had done in the days before. As they sat in the family hall, someone persuaded Ellen to play the harp-like instrument that was set up in the corner, and Margaret sang. The guests were spellbound by the beauty of the music. Then Taran told them stories about his ancestors, for he was part of a long line of brave and charismatic Inger kings. The children played a game similar to chess on the floor in front of the fire, or read books until it was time for them to go to bed. At 10 o'clock, they all retired to get some rest. Jane and Jason had both been given their own quarters, and had found them quite comfortable. They walked down the hallway together until they reached Jason's rooms. Saying good night, Jane continued down the hallway to her own rooms, which were several doors down. Jason went in and lit the 2 lanterns which were placed on either end of the long dresser that stood against the wall opposite the door. He was in a small anteroom. Its only furniture was the dresser, a low couch, and a small table on which stood a basin and a pitcher for washing. There were pegs on the wall for coats and hats. A door to the right, hung with a heavy curtain, led from this room into the bedroom. Jason unfastened his sword belt and laid the sword in its scabbard on the dresser, between the 2 lamps. The jewels of the blue triangle sparkled in the light, and the silver gleamed softly. He was still in awe of the weapon, even though it had been his for several weeks. Footsteps in the hallway tore his gaze away from the sword. He turned just in time to see Prince Ezra stride by on the way to his own chambers, which were right next to Jason's. He was also in time to catch one withering glance from those haughty eyes. Jason winced, remembering the embarrassing conversation about his inability to sword fight. Pushing those thoughts out of his mind, he crossed the room, closed the door, and then went to the bedroom for some much-needed rest. Around midnight, Ezra was tossing and turning in his bed. From the stillness of the house, he guessed that everyone else was already fast asleep. He was hot and uncomfortable, his nightshirt sticking unpleasantly to him. Glaring into the blackness of his room, he reviewed the events of the day and thought darkly about the decision his father had made, a decision that was flatly against Ezra's will. He had debated his father through all the meetings with the ministers, to no avail. His father had patiently repeated all the circumstances in favor of the 2 strangers, and the ministers had agreed that the time for action had come. He clenched his jaw in his fists. It was a dark day for his tribe, a dark day for him. A humiliating day in which he had been forced to argue with the tribe's leaders and to associate with that boy whom he had grown to detest over the past few days. He'd watched his people, his servants, and even his family fawning over the 2 kids, despite their obvious lack of merit. He drew a hand over his forehead and closed his eyes. In his mind, he could see the sword of the kingdom and the way it had glimmered and flashed in Jason's hand. He flopped over onto his side impatiently, clutching a handful of hair. The boy didn't even know how to wield the most precious weapon in the kingdom. Why in heaven's name did he deserve it? On a sudden impulse, he tossed off the covers and got up, growling softly as the hem of his pants snagged on the edge of his bedstead. Freeing it, he moved through the 3 rooms of his apartment and opened the door carefully. All was dark and completely silent in the hall. Turning to the right, he crept to the next door. He put his ear to it and listened. All was quiet. Jason was asleep, of course. Ezra slowly laid a hand on the doorknob and waited. It wasn't locked. How foolish of such a supposedly important political figure. He pushed it open. It made no sound, and astonished at his own audacity, Ezra stole into Jason's anteroom. The sword of the kingdom was across the room, lying on the dresser, he knew, even though the room was dark. He had seen Jason laying it there when he had passed by earlier. His heart thumping in his throat, he moved in that direction, groping in front of him. Jason, who had been in a deep sleep, jolted awake, startled by a sudden feeling of alarm. Propping himself up on one elbow, he tensely waited, listening, and stared into the dark. Ezra could now make out the set of blue gems glowing faintly in the dark, clearly lit by some magic of their own. His hand touched metal. He had found the sword. Gently, he closed his right hand around the hilt, and his left around the sheath. He was shaking. He slowly drew it from its sheath and held it up. It took his breath away. He was holding the sword of the kingdom. This was a moment that he, a devoted swordsman, had dreamt about all his life. But something wasn't right. As he held it up, suddenly the gems stopped glowing. The sword did not feel comfortable in his hands. It was cold to the touch. The hilt did not warm in his hot fists. And it was strangely heavy. It seemed to be actively pulling his hands towards the floor. There was a choking feeling in his throat. Now he was cold all over. He shuddered and slowly sheathed the sword, laying it back on the dresser. Creeping backwards, he retreated to the door, feeling behind him for the handle. Finally, he found it and drew the door open. Feeling weak and miserable and suddenly terrified at every little noise he made, he stumbled back to his own rooms, reached his bed, and threw himself upon it. He did not weep. He was too proud to weep. but he breathed hard through tightly clenched teeth, shivering, his heart broken. All of his plans were ruined. All that he had dreamed about and worked toward as long as he could remember, all of it was destroyed. His tribe would march to its death at the heels of an untrained pair of foreigners, and there was nothing he could do about it, because ancient magic dictated it must be so. What a cruel, cruel fate. Exhausted by his emotions, he eventually fell into a troubled sleep. Jason knew exactly what had happened, even though he could see nothing and had not left his bed. With a strange sort of intuition, combined with what he already knew, he was without a doubt as to who was in the anteroom and what was happening. But he did not make a sound or move to stop it. He knew he would only get threatened or perhaps killed with his own sword. An instinct told him simply to wait and see what happened. When the subtle noises from the other room had ceased, Jason got up and cramped into the anteroom with a sick feeling in his stomach. There was no movement in the room. The prince was gone. Holding his breath, he reached out for the sword. To his relief, it was there. As he grasped the scabbard for a moment, the jewels flickered back to life, gleaming softly as if to assure him that the weapon was unharmed. Late into the night, Jason remained awake. Chapter 9. When Carrie came on deck the next morning, the weather was still dark and unpleasant. It was quite chilly, but more humid than usual, and the wind tugged hard at her as she hustled toward Brian's cabin. She hauled the door open, and as she stepped inside, was surprised to see Captain Larkpin, Captain York, and Captain Jules, the latter two were the captains of the other warships, gathered around the table with Brian, studying the sea chart. They all looked grave, she noted quickly. They glanced up at her when she came in. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said. "Excuse the intrusion. I can come back later." "No, Carrie," Brian said hastily. "Come in, please."
"We are glad to see you here, ma'am," Captain York assured her.
Carrie closed the door and walked over to join them at the table. "What's happening? Is something wrong?"
"There is no danger at hand," Captain Larkpin said, "but this is a significant moment for us all."
"How so?"
"Half an hour ago we passed the Gateway Islands. We are now in the wild waters."
Carrie felt her heart thump. Of course this was no surprise, for they had fully intended to pass the Gateway Islands and to go far beyond them. But the Gateway Islands marked the place where familiar sea routes ended. Beyond was where all the mysterious and often deadly encounters that sailors narrated were said to have happened. Only daring adventurers or unfortunate crews, blown drastically off course, had reason to travel in this region. Not only were the waters lacking any populated islands, but the Black Pass was on the other side of them. For a couple hundred years, the region had been left mostly alone by sailors, and few who had ever determined to sail all the way across had returned to tell the tale. Trade routes were much more extensive on the eastern side of Carrie's country, where there were many thriving islands and continents nearby, so that an abundance of fairly reliable and often frequented courses ran between them. But to the west, 2 to 3 weeks' worth of sailing was about as far as ships ever went. But here they were, beyond the Gateway Islands, pressing onward with speed unabated, and the Black Pass was waiting for them. We change scenes. When morning dawned on the Inger hamlet and Ezra awoke, his broken sorrow of the night before had been replaced by a cold, stony feeling that settled deep within him. He was in a horrid mood as soon as he opened his eyes. Throwing off the covers, he got up, changed out of his night clothes, and stood before the mirror, fuming inwardly as he combed his hair, pinned his cape into place, and fastened on his everyday short sword. When he came to that last article, he had a strong temptation to pitch the stupid thing across the room, but decided against it. Everyone was used to seeing him wear it, and he did not want any questions or disruptions this morning. He couldn't quite remember everything that had happened last night until he gave it some thought. Then it all came back and worsened his mood significantly. Trying to calm his boiling feelings, he finally left his room. Halfway down the hallway to the dining room, he met his father coming from the opposite direction, along with the very person he had been hoping to avoid for as long as possible that morning. "Good morning, son," Taryn said affectionately. "Good morning, father," Ezra replied, hearing the strange tone of his own voice as he tried to collect his wits. "Jason," he added grudgingly, nodding at the young man. Jason gave a slight nod in return. "We'll meet you in the dining room shortly," Taryn said, continuing down the hallway past Ezra, who stood aside to make way for them. "There is a map in my study that I wanted to show Jason. I remembered it last night and must get it for him before all the hustle of the ceremony preparations makes me forget again." Jason fell back several paces behind Taryn and paused as he passed Ezra. Squaring up to him, he looked keenly in the prince's face. "Sleep well?" he asked, and walked away. Ezra stepped out in the middle of the hall, staring after him. His face went white and then deep red, but Jason couldn't see that. He had already disappeared into Terran's study. The prince turned and swept down the hallway, turned the corner, brushed past the surprised servant, and rushed out the back door, nearly slamming it behind him. That afternoon, when the royal servants were bustling about preparing for the alliance ceremony, Jason walked out by himself into the streets. He was on his way to ask Mason if he knew anything about the history of Jane's ring, or if he could tell Jason more about the Sword of the Kingdom. Perhaps he had a record of ancient or magical weapons that could provide some clues. He was walking down a quiet back street when he suddenly had an uneasy feeling that someone was watching him. Abruptly he turned around, in time to see a shadowy figure ducking into the space between two houses, clearly in the act of following him. He pressed himself up against the wall of one of the houses, edging his way towards the opening. But before he could leap out and confront the pursuer, he suddenly found himself face to face with him. "Prince Rossley," he said in surprise. The boy stood quietly in front of him, and met Jason's gaze confidently. "What were you doing?" Jason asked, a little disturbed. He must have tailed him all the way from the royal residence, and he had never made the slightest noise. "I was following you." "I know that. Why exactly?" "I was waiting for the right moment to talk with you in private." Jason raised his eyebrows. "Again, why?" "I'm delivering a message." "A message? Who from?" "My brother, Prince Ezra." "Oh." Jason felt his stomach tighten. It made sense now. "What does he have to say?" "He told me to approach you in secret, and to tell you that he wishes to meet with you at 3:30 in the woods behind the hamlet." Jason stared at the prince for a moment, his mind racing. Finally, he forced himself to speak. "Is that all?" "He entreats you to say nothing about this meeting to anyone else. That is all." "I see." There was another long pause, and Rossley turned away to leave. But he paused. "Mr. Fields," he said hesitantly. "What is it?" "I am simply delivering the message. I have nothing to do with this." Jason swallowed. "I know. You're fine, Rossley." Rossley gave a slight bow and slipped silently away. Jason paced up and down the alley for a moment. His first thought was that Prince Ezra was up to no good. But the last part of the message, "he entreats you to say nothing," made him consider one other option. Perhaps the prince had realized the error of his ways and wanted to apologize for his attitude, maybe even confess what he had done last night. With what Jason knew of the prince's pride, he was certain that he would never want his subjects to know of such things, hence the secret meeting. As he walked slowly back to the royal house, entirely forgetting his errand to Mason's, he turned it over and over again in his mind. He could not decide whether the invitation meant war or peace. There was no strong indication either way, but deep down inside, a little voice was whispering to Jason that there was trouble brewing. Finally, he made up his mind. He would go to meet the prince. He was tired of the tense interactions, tired of the prince snubbing him and glaring at him, tired of feeling his own frustrations stewing within him in the midst of the wonderful relationship he was building with King Terran and the rest of the tribe. Whether the prince meant to attack him or apologize, Jason wanted to get it all out in the open. But that didn't mean he wouldn't take precautions. The time had come. Jason wrote a quick note to Jane, simply saying that he was out on private business, assuring her that he would be back in plenty of time to get ready for the ceremony, and telling her not to worry. He put the note in Jane's anteroom. No servants were nearby. They were all busy elsewhere, preparing for the ceremony. Jason was able to make his way to the back door unquestioned and slip out. There were no houses on this side of the royal residence. The mountain rose in front of him, with the forest tumbling down its sides and over the steep hills clustered at its base. Jason looked up at the sky. It was overcast, with a few dark, rainy-looking spots scattered amongst the milder gray clouds. There were wisps and patches of mist streaking the sides of the mountain and swirling amongst some of the higher hills. A falcon wheeled around, high in the air near the mountain, and gave a shrill, lonesome call. Jason wondered absently if it was Rossley's falcon. Hoping that Ezra had chosen the woods on one of the lower hills for their meeting place, Jason took a deep breath and set out. Meanwhile, Jane and Margaret were walking down the main lane to the royal house together, talking and laughing merrily. They were both in high spirits, anticipating the ceremony and the banquet that night, and rejoicing in Terran's agreement to the alliance. Jane had a package tucked under her arm. It was a dress for the banquet, which she had picked out and had adjusted to her size that day by the tribe's best seamstress. Jane had tried as hard as she could to pay for the dress, but the seamstress refused to accept. insisting that it would be an honor to see someone of such significance wearing the work of her hands. There was now a fairly steady stream of servants and workers going to and from the banquet hall, with carts full of items for the ceremony. Jane could sense the excitement in the air, and was pleased to know that things were going so well. She could hardly believe how smoothly this entire mission had proceeded. "I haven't seen Jason in a while," Margaret commented. "Me neither. I need to find him, though. I have to talk to him about tonight. The director of the event gave me the order of ceremonies, with special details as to what we're supposed to do. I need to show him the paper so we can both be ready." "You aren't nervous, are you?" Margaret asked with a smile. "Well, I guess I'm a little edgy about our part in the ceremony. Jason and I aren't used to this sort of thing." "Oh, you'll be fine. You are more poised than you realize, Jane." "Thanks," Jane said gratefully, trying to envision what part of her conduct could possibly seem poised. They entered the royal house and stopped by Jane's room so that she could put away her dress. As they turned to leave, Jane noticed the piece of paper lying on the table near the door. "Hold on a minute. It looks like Jason left me a note," she said, taking it up. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, watching Jane's face as she read. Jane looked up. "It's a little strange," she said slowly, looking puzzled, "but I guess it's all right." She handed the note to Margaret. "It seems to be fine," the princess said when she finished reading. "Yes, but what private business would he have? We've done just about everything together since we got here." "He has met a lot of Ingers during the time he has been here. Perhaps one of them wanted to talk to him. That's perfectly harmless." "I guess," Jane said reluctantly. "Besides, he told you not to worry." "Yeah, that's what bothers me."